everything is downstream from theology. Any political problem we have today is simply just exposing and sort of shedding light on a spiritual problem. We think we're flying right side up as a people, when in actuality we're flying upside down. The luxury of our liberties over time has made us fat in many ways, intellectually, spiritually. Paganism is without a doubt on a rise. We want to be God of our own world, and I think that is the driving factor of Marxism. Marxism's got a lot of things wrong with it, but it's got good PR. We don't need to please the comment section. We need to please, our creator, and there's a big difference there. This is potentially the church's greatest hour, at least in a long time.
This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. Truth, deception, and the future of the church. That's the focus of today's conversation. We're joined by Lucas Miles, Vice President at Turning Point USA and head of TPUSA Faith, where he works to equip pastors and believers to think clearly and respond faithfully in a rapidly changing culture. Catch this episode anywhere you listen to podcasts, or the full video version on YouTube or crm.tv. And now let's welcome Lucas Miles to the City of God. So Lucas, as we approach the 250th anniversary of American independence, it certainly feels like there's something off, that something's wrong. Is the problem in America a political problem, or is there something much deeper here?
Look, I think that everything always goes downstream from theology and faith. I think that what we think about God, what we think about ourselves within the context or relationship with the divine, I think is always going to shape everything else that we hold to. Breitbart was famous for saying everything's downstream of culture. I would go a step further, and I would say everything is downstream from theology. And so any political problem we have today is simply just exposing and sort of shedding light on a spiritual problem, I think is a greater place that I would be looking right now.
You've said before that we're not just dealing with bad ideas, but deception. What do you mean by that?
We could sit around a think tank and come up with policies, and if people have good intention, if people have a unified perspective of what is truth, if our plumb line is in agreement with one another, we can debate those policies and figure out who's got the best idea and how it's going to work out. And over time, those things will be seen. But when you're dealing with essentially what I would call like an upside down world, we have a question. It's like we're that pilot flying through the clouds, and there's something wrong with the with the instruments that we have on the board, and for some reason that horizon line has been flipped, and we think we're flying right side up as a people, when in actuality we're flying upside down, and we can't tell really where we stand in time and space. And I think that we have people that have fallen into that deception. It's the problem we see prophesied in Isaiah, that there is going to come a day where people will call good evil and evil good. And I think that that I'm not trying to make a eschatological statement here, other than I think we're in a moment as that in time, and we have to be very, very discerning right now. As we navigate this, we got to tap on the instruments a little bit to see if we can get those to, reset to, really a true north.
Yeah. As I said in a sermon recently, preaching on Romans 13, that the role of the government is to promote good and restrain evil. But what happens when a government redefines good and evil? And so a nation that was founded on biblical truth, how in the world did we get here 250 years later, where we can't even define good and evil according to that standard that we see in the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we're seeing the sort of inventions of men whose hearts have been twisted and turned away from the Lord, long ago. And I think we would share this theologically. Humanity has a depravity problem, right? And so we cannot expect, without the Lord being involved in our framework, our ethos, our mindset, that for us to come up with the right answers on our own, we're not going to get there. And so, and I think especially when you're dealing with such a time of peace and prosperity that we've had historically, it's very easy for creativity to get the best of us. And not that I would ever want to see and promote, problems and hardships and war and all these sorts of things and happening, but I think that the lavishness, the luxury of our liberties over time has made us fat in many ways, intellectually, spiritually. We've stopped looking for a source. We started thinking that we are the genesis of ourselves, that we are the source of life, that we are the sustainer, of our future. And I think that this is what we have right now is inevitable on the other side of that. I'm still optimistic about where we can go, but I think that we have to face the facts, on a very high level and see what's happening here. And there is an agenda, and it's not, I'm talking about this very broadly, but there are people and organizations and individuals who are seeking to really dismantle this framework, this Judeo-Christian framework that we have and that we operate through. And I think that it's for a purpose. It's to usurp our Christian values, to push them to the side so that a Marxist worldview can be accepted. Marxism doesn't work in a Christian world. You go right away, that doesn't line up. It's antithetical to one another. And so it's more easily rejected. If you can replace those Christian values and indoctrinate a younger generation with a pagan or postmodern framework, now all of a sudden Marxism starts sounding good. And so it becomes kind of the best idea available if you don't have a truly true idea available, to yourself.
Lucas, you mentioned Marxism. I mean, the proof's in the pudding. We see the millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people that have lost their lives at the hands of Marxist regimes. But at the same time, if we know that from history, it's factual, it's not opinion, why does it continue to be re-embraced by every generation in some way?
Yeah, I mean, look, Marxism's got a lot of things wrong with it, but it's got good PR, and I think that for whatever reason, it's not for whatever reason. The reason's simple. We want to be God of our own world, and I think that is the driving factor of Marxism. And it's this idea, within Marxism, we always talk about the oppressor versus oppressed framework. Well, from a systematic standpoint, the greatest oppressor, it's not just the government or the man or the rich or eventually you start going, well, who's behind them? Who's behind them? And if you're, an atheist Marxist, eventually the person you have to blame it's God, it's Christianity, it's religion, it's this teaching about Jesus Christ. That's the real oppressor that we have to get away with. That's the thing that's holding me back. It's Gnostic in that sense in its framework, that it's this I think it was Heidegger that called it like the throneness of life, that we're just sort of like cast out there and in this state of essentially oppression, that God has oppressed us in the creation itself, and that we have to, through this intellectual ascent, come to some higher knowledge. And I think that we see that same Gnostic pattern operating within Marxism today, that we're trying to ascend beyond the state of life that we're in at this moment. And I think that at its core, it is anti-God, it's anti-faith. And I think that, ultimately that's what we're fighting against.
I'm going to make some general statements about kind of the history of the West over the last few hundred years. I mean, you go back 200 years, you go back 100 years, predominantly Christian society. Then we moved into modernism, postmodernism, secularism, believe whatever you want to believe. We just don't want God in the public square. Would it be fair to say, generally speaking, that we are slowly moving out, or we have moved out of secularism, and now we are in a state of the culture is embracing paganism, a neo-paganism, where it's no longer believe whatever you want to believe, but the state and the cultural elites are going to tell you what to believe, where they are re-embracing neo-paganism as the new religion of the West?
Yeah, I mean, first off, there's multiple things happening at once, and multiple things can be true at once. But this issue of paganism is without a doubt on a rise. I spent about the last year and a half working on a new book called Pagan Threat, and that was my premise, is that we have And that evolved out of, from my research, the study that I had done on exposing progressive Christianity and wokeism within the church. And what I found is that the Marxism, which is kind of that woke component, it needs a vehicle. It's a parasite. It can't walk on its own. It has to have something that carries it around in order for it to be effective and kind of inject its toxin and venom, out into the world. And so for a time, it used the church as that vehicle. We saw that in liberation theology. We saw it first with, Gutierrez and in kind of the Latin American, or Latin Catholic, variant of liberation theology that still has a place today, as it still has some talents there. We also saw it within James Cone's work and Black liberation theology. But I think that, you only are going to go so far with progressive Christianity, because if you push into the Marxist side of that long enough, you will deconstruct from your faith and you'll no longer have a need for the church aspect of it. And so it'll just be, I'm a Marxist, right? But if you push into the Christian side of progressive Christianity or the Christian left, what you'll eventually see if you actually start reading the scriptures is that, hey, I think what I'm reading here is antithetical to what I'm believing over here, and there's a separation that exists. Progressive Christianity is still operable or operatable. It's still something that can be dissected and separated. It's not fused fully together. That these are two unique things that have just they seem symbiotic at the time, but they can be pulled apart because the one thing is a parasite. But the problem is when Marxism starts recognizing that Christianity can't take it any further. And that there is a limit on how far Christianity can go with it, because you cannot adopt much of the critical framework of, say, critical queer theory. Christianity has a lot of verses that speak against that. Critical race theory, Christianity has a lot of verses that speak against this. So you can do kind of a smoke and mirrors, exegetically speaking, for a while and kind of hide these doctrines and try to justify certain things. But eventually you get to a point to where it doesn't go any further. And so what has to happen at that point is you need a new host. And I think that new host is paganism. It doesn't matter what kind of paganism. I just talked to a guy the other day on campus that now has started believing in Norse, mythology essentially as his god. So he's worshiping the Nordic gods. I've seen others that are, following more kind of a Greco-Roman, approach, and, Zeus and Hercules and these these are storybooks. They're obvious. There's no historicity really behind these things. But yet this younger generation, it doesn't care. Fact and mythology has, it's almost inseparable, I think, for many of them. And so this is a real thing, and it's expected to triple in the next, 10 years or so.
Yeah, it's ironic that the decades of fighting for secularism, keep religion out of the public square, has now given rise to all of these ideologies that, in my opinion, are absolutely destroying the West. You mentioned progressive Christianity. Let's dive a little deeper into that. It's been said, and I agree, and I think you would agree as well, that progressive Christianity is not just it's not a subset of Christianity. It's a false religion.
Yeah.
For those that are new maybe to the phrase or this false religion of progressive Christianity, what is it, and why is it such a threat to the church today?
Yeah, so, I kind of mentioned earlier liberation theology. I think liberation theology is at least an early iteration of progressive Christianity. And it's basically, when we talk about progressive Christianity, what we are saying is that this is Christianity that is in form and structure. It resembles the church, but the inside, the content, the guts of it have been hollowed out and been filled with something that's quite foreign to the gospel, and really another gospel altogether. And, when you go back to the early heresies in the church, you had, of course, the Judaizers that we read about in the New Testament. You also have Gnostics that are sort of alluded to, but not called out by name until, in later early patristic documents. And what you see with the Gnostics is that if you wanted to find a Gnostic in the first century, you wouldn't go to a Gnostic like meeting house. You would go to the church. That's where they sort of invaded this seemingly newly formed community as a body of Christ, and they blended in among them. And I think that that's what's happened with progressive Christianity, is that you have individuals who have adopted a truly Marxist framework. They view the world as oppressor versus oppressed. They see that the goal, again, the goal of Marxism or communism is to seize the means of production, and there's no greater production than the human mind. And so I think what we're seeing in culture is this attempt to control the development, indoctrination, training of the human mind, and that starts with children, which is why our school systems are such a critical, of critical interest for a Marxist, and why we have to protect that. And so this has been going on for some time. I mean, I've done work to all the way back. We see early iterations of this in the late 1700s. We can look to people like Hegel and Kant that were very influential in this. But in today's more modern world, it's taken on a mind of its own. And it is essentially using Jesus and the gospel as propaganda to support illegal immigration, a divergent, view of sex, marriage, and gender, to, really have an anti-West sort of mindset. Now we're seeing it actually expand into a pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian. So it's kind of actually losing a little bit of its Christianness, if you will, in order to, Jesus is so loving that he'd also be Muslim, is kind of the language that we're seeing out there. And so there's no historical, teeth to sink in on this, but it doesn't matter because it's really good at rewriting history and kind of giving you whatever narrative it needs to in order to justify itself. It's much like AI, where it will lie to you on purpose, and it's very difficult to kind of tell, what a truth from a lie in those regards.
Yeah. It's amazing. Theological compromise never just affects the church, but you do see how it has societal effects as well. One of the things I appreciate about you is you're a big fan of the church. You believe in the church. It is the greatest institution that the world has ever seen. And for 2,000 years, when the church has been at its best, it's brought flourishing for all people. What is your message to pastors and churches about the need to safeguard the pulpit, the need in America right now in particular to have sound and courageous pulpits, not just for their churches, but for society as a whole?
I spent 18 months working alongside Charlie Kirk and really underneath his leadership in my role overseeing TPUSA Faith. And, it was the honor of my life to be able to do that. I had no intention to ever work for Charlie. I met him in 2020. I thought he was, quite remarkable young man and appreciate what he did. But I was doing kind of my own thing. And I was working on developing a platform really to help unite pastors across denominational lines after, and really kind of in the wake of everything with COVID that had happened, to stand for truth during that season. I started seeing churches that were being shut down and told they couldn't sing or they couldn't worship in places like California. I saw a lot of churches willingly, closed down for extended periods of time, thinking that they were doing the right thing, by doing that. I saw pastors marching, with Marxist organizations like BLM. I saw, we talk about the transitioning of young people due to the transgender movement. I would say the even greater, more concerning transitioning that I saw, although that transition is concerning as well, were parents who were formerly, held to a biblical worldview on sex and gender. When they started seeing their child struggle, they instantly flipped their position, and now all of a sudden, and they just completely just caved to that. And so, these things all got my attention. I do love the church. I grew up in church. I had kind of a Samuel upbringing where I lived down the street from a church. I broke into the church so many times to play basketball and hang out with my friends that they eventually gave me a key. I think I was the only 13-year-old in the country with a key to a 30,000 square foot church building. And I spent a lot of time there. And during that time I was, and I know people have had church hurt and all those things. That wasn't my experience growing up. That came later, but it wasn't my experience then. I had a very, very healthy relationship with a couple of the staff members there, took me under their wing, discipled me, would hear me out, would answer questions from me. It was a very safe, formidable time for me. And I went into ministry and preaching very young. I was probably 17 when I started preaching. And, there's just never seemed like really that many other options. I had thought about some other career paths, but, I couldn't escape that this was a call in my life. My call today for me, I know it well. And that is, I really feel that the Lord has put me in this position that I'm in right now with Turning Point to help unite the church around primary doctrine. You and I could find things to disagree over coffee about, but we're unified in primary belief because we understand what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be brothers in Christ, and the work that we have before us. We understand what the real enemy is. And I think we've seen too many Christians and denominations and pastors, fighting over secondary positions. Now, the question is always, what are the secondary positions? And, I think that it's in deception. You could have somebody say, well, yeah, I might have a different view of marriage or sexuality, but that's just secondary. I believe in the Trinity, and I believe that God's creator, and I believe that Jesus is coming back. What's so bad about that? And I would say that when we see these things that are these, kind of progressive markers today, they're actually symptomatic of primary deficiency. That, when you don't agree with God on the issue of life, the issue of marriage, the issue of gender and sex, the issue of, marriage, you go down the list, then what you're really saying is you don't believe that God is creator, or at least you don't trust him as creator. Yeah. You think that our idea as man of creator of these things is better than God's. And so although they might be secondary to a degree, they're symptomatic of a primary deficiency. And I think that we have to call this what it is. I told Charlie when I came on board that I said, I want you to understand, I said, I know who you are. And he goes, who's that? And I said, you're Constantine. And I said, none of the bad things. And he goes, I'm listening. And I said, you understand? He goes, why would you say that? And I said, you understand the value of a strong church in the nation, and you're not a pastor, but you know the importance of getting the pastors together and shutting them in a room and saying, guys, you have to figure this out. And I think a lot of the work that I do today at TPUSA Faith is this why our pastor summits and everything else that we're doing is so important. We're doing 3 of those this year, by the way, is that we are putting pastors in the room and we're saying, guys, we got some major issues in front of us today. We're wrestling through this Islamicist issue. We're wrestling through the immigration issue. We're wrestling through the Israel issue. We're wrestling through, sexual identity, for young people and everything else. Like, we have to have a polemic and an apologetic, an argument for these things from a biblical standpoint. And we need to get in the room and we need to leave here unified on this. We might have disagreements about eschatology, but we need to know, the mission right now, and we need to be those sons of Issachar that we understand the time and what we need to do about it.
Turning Point has just an incredible legacy of being able to capture the minds and the hearts of the next generation and really give them a platform, that remnant, of young people that want to stand for biblical truth and need the resources and the tools. My 13-year-old daughter started watching YouTube videos of Charlie about 2 years ago, and just how it strengthened her faith. Speaking to the next generation, for those that are listening, what does a courageous Christian witness look like for a high school student, a college-age student in today's cultural climate?
Yeah, when we look at kind of the history of this word, like martyr, and the word, witness, we think about that oftentimes as somebody who's willing to kind of give their life, for the faith. The early usage of these things like witness was, just somebody who was willing to testify. It didn't necessarily imply that you were giving your life. It was just that you were going to stand strong for the faith in that way. And I think that, we're in a time where there is more at stake than I think at least there has been in a really long time. I don't know if I want to say ever before, because we've had some very trying times in the history of the church. But this is a major moment for us, and I think for the church in America, this might be the most defining day that we've ever had. A lot has changed since Charlie was killed, and the world changed very quickly. It seemed that God was using him in so many ways to, I think, hold some things back. And, people saw Charlie in his videos, and you saw him out there, kind of, being bold and picking up the microphone, and all those things are beloved reasons and honorable reasons to remember him for. But Charlie was also very involved behind the scenes. When somebody got out of line who he was friends with, he'd be the first to shoot him a text and be like, knock it off, that you're getting distracted, stay on the main thing. Like he was, willing to call those balls and strikes, I think, for the conservative movement, as well as at times for pastors, and he would always, when at our pastor summits, he would always go, hey, I'm not a pastor, you guys are the pastors. And in hindsight, my view has changed on that a little bit. I think in many ways he was pastoring a lot of people, and he didn't even realize it. And I don't think they realized it fully until afterwards. But something happened at his memorial where there was an awakening. There was this awareness that took place. And, for a moment, it felt like the church was the most unified that it had ever been. And it might have been. It might have been the moment that Christians were more unified than they ever had been before in the history of Christendom. Really, especially at least post-Reformation. And at that moment, that night, actually, after the memorial, came back with my staff. I was in Phoenix, just had left the venue, and we went to a church that hosted our faith team for a kind of just a potluck dinner. And it was really just a time for, essentially to hold a wake for Charlie. And so we laughed, we cried, we told stories, and before the night was over, I shared with the team. I said, look, I don't know what's going to happen after this, but I know this: the unity that we experienced today, this was like a supernatural moment, and the enemy doesn't like it. And I don't know where it's going to be coming from, but there's going to be like a major attack for an attempt to bring disunity here. And I don't, I didn't think that up ahead of time. It was just like it came out, and I didn't think about it even until later on. And we've seen that, we have more division, at least at the time of this recording, than we've had in a really long time. And I think this is why we need strong pastors. That, we're not looking for podcasters to, fix the problem. We're not looking for social media influencers to fix the problem. I think that we need strong pastors to stand up in the pulpit and to be bold and to, say hard things and to take us through the scriptures and wrestle with these things with us in such a way that brings us back to, a biblical view. We don't need to please the comment section. We need to please, our Creator, and there's a big difference there. And so this is it potentially the church's greatest hour, at least in a long time. And I would just implore pastors to recognize the mission before you. Your job is to help people to think biblically in the boardroom, in the bedroom, and at the ballot box. And if you're not doing that, I don't think you're doing your whole job.
Yeah. Lucas, a final question. Briefly, share with our audience a little bit about Turning Point Faith. Charlie selected you to lead the charge. For those that are listening that maybe they want to get their pastor engaged, what's on the horizon for Turning Point Faith, and how can they get engaged?
Yeah, so TPUSA Faith, you can go to tpusafaith.com. It's kind of the hub for all things. We have quite a few initiatives that we're working on right now. So first off, I will tell you, before I was on staff, before I knew Charlie very well, I had a regional manager from TPUSA Faith come and meet with me. And I literally, I sat down with him for lunch. He's telling me all these free things available to me, curriculum and pastor summits and, all trips and, hey, if I want to go here, want to do this, we're just here to support you however we can. And then I go back to my wife and some of my staff. I said, I don't know what's going on over there. I said, but I felt, I'm like, it sounded just too good to be true. And I feel like that somewhere along the lines, I'm going to get a bill sent to me. And, I was afraid it was a timeshare presentation is what I was afraid of. I can tell you on the other side of that, that's actually, the pitch is that easy. It's going, guys, we have amazing donors. We had an amazing founder and CEO who love the church. We have resources set aside for no other purpose than to help support the church, to be strong and to be biblical. And we want to help equip you. And so we do. Right now we're doing 3 pastor summits a year. We have one in Dallas. We have one in Santa Barbara. We have one in Detroit. Those will be available. The Detroit one and Santa Barbara one are in the fall. And you can go to TPUSA Faith. We oftentimes, as long as they're available, we're paying for hotels. We help make it as affordable for possible as for our pastors. We want no excuse for you to show up to this, because we know it's a life-changing experience, and pastors are sometimes the worst at taking time off and getting together with other pastors. And this is the type of unity that we need to solve the problems that we have before us right now and to really understand what's going on. We have a lot of curriculum available. So we have a new course on Islam that we're rolling out called Deconstructing Islam. If you don't have a good, really polemic or argument when somebody starts talking about Islam, this is something you need to get your hands on. We have courses on overcoming pornography. We have courses on marriage. We have a new course called First Truths with myself and Dr. Jeff Myers, one of my favorites, really establishing kind of that primary doctrine conversation within the church. And these are all made to not be denominational specific. It's not, we work with churches across the spectrum. We have Presbyterians, we have charismatics, we have Calvary chapels, we have Baptists, we have continuation. I mean, all different kinds of churches that are there, and we love them all, and we really want to be a resource to there. I'm not there to bring my own secondary positions. I'm there to help support them. And so I view us as sort of the supply line for the church. The pastors out there are the generals. I'm still pastoring myself. I still have a congregation in Indiana. I've been pastoring the same church for 20 years. Charlie invited me to quit that and to basically move to Phoenix and only do TPUSA Faith. And I said, Charlie, look, it's going to be more work, but I think that I need to keep my pulpit. And so I travel throughout the week for TPUSA Faith, and I'm home about 3 weekends a month to preach, because I feel if I'm going to tell pastors, hey, this is important for you to do, then I should be doing it myself, and I want to lead the way in that.
Yeah. Had an opportunity to be with you at the Pastor Summit in Gainesville.
Yes.
Excited to be at the Pastor Summit in Dallas.
Well, you're a great addition, and honestly, we love your voice, the wisdom that you bring, and just the heart for the church today. I think that you have just been a great bridge builder, from your movement. And, sometimes it's hard to get, the Reform guys and the charismatic guys in the same room. And I think that when we do, good things happen, and there's a sharpening that takes place. Nobody's there to try to change anybody or talk them out of their denominational position. We're there to leave better Presbyterians and better charismatics and better Baptists on the other side of that. And I think if we can kind of cheer each other on, my belief is that, we're going to all over time be conformed more and more into his image.
Amen to that. Well, God be with you in this journey. You're doing important kingdom work. We're praying for you, proud to partner with you. And thank you so much for being on the City of God.
Thanks for having me.
That was a challenging and timely conversation with Lucas. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, I'd ask you to take a moment and leave a 5-star review. It helps more people discover the City of God. And while you're at it, share it with a family member or a friend. You can stay connected with me and Coral Ridge Ministries throughout the week by following us on social media. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. This City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.